At 11:11 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday night in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Austin Vance unlocked the heavy timber door of his private mountain cabin. The storm outside was howling off the Grand Tetons, driving ice against the pine logs, but inside, the air was still and warm. Austin flipped the wall switch. A single iron lamp filled the room with amber light, and that was when he stopped dead in his tracks. Lying across the white duvet of his king-sized bed, fully clothed in a drenched navy wool coat with her leather boots still dripping onto the rug, was a woman fast asleep. She was a stranger, a black woman with high cheekbones and exhaustion carved into her face. Clutched tightly against her chest, held with both hands like a weapon, was a wet leather folder containing the original master deed to Austin's 12,000-acre ranch. Before Austin could take a step or reach for his sidearm, the front door behind him slammed open against the log wall. His nephew Chadwick rushed into the cabin accompanied by two armed ranch security guards. Chadwick pointed a trembling finger at the bed and shouted, "Uncle Austin, step back from her. That woman is a corporate intruder. She broke into the Denver office, stole our land titles, and fled. I tracked her GPS right here." Austin did not reach for his gun. He looked at his nephew's tailored suit, spotless despite the blizzard outside. He looked at the mud on the sleeping woman's boots, and then he looked at the wet leather folder in her hands. The woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked directly at Austin Vance, completely unbothered by the armed men in the doorway, and whispered four words, "Check the water rights." But to understand how a top corporate forensic auditor from Atlanta ended up asleep in a billionaire cowboy's private cabin holding a stolen land deed at 11:11 p.m., we have to go back 72 hours. Austin Vance was 52 years old, and he was a man built out of Wyoming dirt and old-fashioned patience. His family had run cattle in the La Plata and Jackson valleys for 3 generations. His grandfather had cleared the sagebrush with 2 mules and a handsaw, and his father had built the ranch into a respected 12,000-acre operation. Austin had taken those 12,000 acres and turned them into a cattle and conservation empire worth over $1 billion. He was a billionaire, but if you saw him at the local feed store in town, you would never know it. He wore the same scuffed leatherwork boots he had owned for 6 years. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup with mud on the floorboards. He lived mostly in his small timber cabin on the northern ridge of the property because the grand stone estate house his late wife had designed felt too big and too quiet after she passed away 5 years ago. Austin believed in 3 things: the land does not lie, a man's word is his bond, and family comes before profit. Therefore, when his younger brother passed away 8 years ago, Austin took his nephew, Chadwick Vance, under his wing. Chadwick was 23 at the time, sharp-tongued, smooth-talking, and ambitious. Austin paid for Chadwick's business degree at Columbia University, gave him a generous trust fund, and eventually appointed him to manage the ranch's corporate investment arm from a high-rise office building in downtown Denver. Chadwick was 31 now. He wore $3,000 custom suits, drove an imported European sports car, and loved talking to financial reporters about modernizing the West. Austin gave Chadwick near total freedom with the financial accounts because he trusted his family. He assumed Chadwick shared the same reverence for the land that had fed 3 generations of Vances. He was wrong. Chadwick did not see the Vance Ranch as a sacred family legacy. He saw it as a massive, underutilized asset sitting on top of gold mines, water reserves, and commercial real estate opportunities. Chadwick believed his uncle was an old-fashioned cowboy who was holding the family back from true modern wealth. And so, 3 years ago, Chadwick began looking for a way to take control of the entire estate. Enter Sienna St. James. Sienna St. James was 34 years old, and she lived in Atlanta, Georgia. She was a senior forensic auditor, a brilliant black woman who had made a national name for herself by untangling complex corporate fraud schemes for major financial institutions. She was quiet, meticulous, and completely unbrayable. When Sienna sat down with a stack of bank ledgers, she did not look at names or titles. She looked at the numbers, because numbers always tell the truth if you know how to read them. 2 weeks ago, the independent oversight board that monitored the Vance estate's institutional credit lines hired Sienna's firm to conduct a routine 5-year audit of the ranch's corporate holdings. It was supposed to be a simple review of routine transactions. Before we go back to what Sienna discovered inside those Denver financial files, take a moment and tell us in the comments what town or city you're watching from today. And if you believe that every action carries a consequence, hit that subscribe button and join our community before the next case opens. Sienna arrived at the corporate office in Denver on a Monday morning. Within 48 hours of reviewing the master ledgers, her sharp eyes caught a pattern that 5 different accounting firms had somehow missed. There were subtle, repeating transfers of water access rights moving from the Vance family trust into a series of newly formed, offshore limited liability companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Sienna dug deeper. She pulled tax filings, corporate registry documents, and bank transfer authorizations. What she found made her blood run cold. Chadwick Vance had been executing a massive, sophisticated betrayal for nearly 36 months. He had created a fake paper trail that made it look as though Austin Vance was suffering from early-stage memory loss and signing over management decisions to his nephew. Using forged medical affidavits and altered power of attorney documents, Chadwick had pledged the ranch's priceless water rights as collateral for a $30 million high-risk real estate venture in Denver. When that real estate venture failed, Chadwick did not cut his losses. Instead, he doubled down. He negotiated a secret, illegal buyout deal with a predatory mining conglomerate based out of Salt Lake City. The conglomerate wanted the northern pastureland of the Vance Ranch for open-pit gravel and mineral extraction, which would permanently destroy the water table and poison the soil for miles around. Chadwick was set to pocket $20 million in personal finder fees from the mining company. To cover his tracks, he planned to file for corporate bankruptcy on behalf of the ranch trust, claim his uncle's mismanagement had ruined the business, and force the public sale of the land. Austin Vance would be left penniless, disgraced, and stripped of the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. The final piece Chadwick needed was the physical master deed to the 12,000 acres, which was kept in a fireproof safe inside the Denver corporate office. On Tuesday afternoon, Sienna confronted Chadwick inside his private office. She laid out the paper trail on his glass desk with total calm. She looked at him and said, "Mr. Vance, this is not mismanagement. This is grand larceny, forgery, and federal fraud. I am preparing my final report for the Oversight Board and the State Attorney General tonight." Chadwick did not panic. He offered her $2 million in cash to bury the report. Sienna looked at the checkbook on his desk, then looked him in the eye and said, "My integrity is not for sale, Mr. Vance, and your uncle deserves the truth." That was when Chadwick realized his entire life was about to collapse. He smiled, pretended to accept her decision, and excused himself to call his legal team. But instead of calling an attorney, Chadwick called 2 private security contractors he had on retainer, men who were paid very well to make problems disappear. He told them that a rogue auditor had stolen confidential files and needed to be stopped before she reached Jackson Hole. Sienna knew she was in danger the moment she left the building. She did not go back to her hotel. She went straight to the company's safe, used her auditor's master key to retrieve the original 1898 master land deed and water rights titles, tucked them inside a waterproof leather folder, and got into her rental car. She drove all night toward Jackson Hole, intending to hand the physical evidence directly to Austin Vance. But the mountain weather turned violent. A massive autumn blizzard rolled across the Wyoming border, dropping visibility to near zero and turning the highway into a sheet of black ice. As Sienna pushed her sedan up the winding mountain pass, a heavy black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. It rammed her rear bumper hard enough to send her vehicle spinning across the gravel shoulder. Her car slid down an embankment and crashed into a thick stand of pine trees. Sienna was bruised, her forehead was bleeding, and her rental car was wrecked in a snowdrift. The black SUV stopped at the top of the ridge, and 2 men got out with flashlights, searching the wreckage. Sienna did not scream. She unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbed the leather folder from the passenger seat, crept out through the rear door into the freezing dark, and vanished into the timber before the men reached the car. They found her empty car and her briefcase, assuming they had recovered the files. But Sienna was already trudging through knee-deep snow, moving toward the ridge. She walked for 3 miles through a Wyoming blizzard in freezing temperatures. Her coat was soaked, her boots were caked in mud, and her body was giving out from hypothermia. She knew she would not survive the night in the open woods. But as she crested the northern ridge of the Vance property, she saw a single warm yellow light glowing through the trees. It was Austin Vance's private cabin. She staggered up the porch steps, found the door unlocked, stumbled inside, and collapsed onto the bed. Her body shut down from total exhaustion, still clutching the leather folder against her chest. Which brings us back to 11:11 p.m. on that freezing Tuesday night. Austin Vance stood in the amber light of his bedroom, looking at the stranger asleep on his bed, and looking at his nephew standing in the doorway with 2 armed guards. When we saw this moment before, it looked like a simple break-in. It looked like a billionaire catching a trespasser. But now, we know the truth. Now we know that the woman lying on that duvet had walked through 3 miles of sub-zero mountain woods to save a cowboy she had never met. Now we know that the nephew in the $3,000 suit was standing there with a smile on his face, waiting to destroy his own blood for $20 million in blood money. Chadwick stepped forward, his eyes bright with fake authority. "Uncle Austin, let my guards handle this. She is dangerous. Hand over that leather folder, and we will take her to the sheriff in town." Austin did not hand over the folder. He looked at Sienna, whose eyes were open now, blood dried on her forehead, her lips blue from the cold. He looked at her hands, raw and scraped from the branches. Then he looked at Chadwick's spotless leather shoes. Austin spoke, his voice low, calm, and heavier than thunder. "Chadwick." "Yes, uncle. You said you tracked her GPS here from Denver?" "That is right," Chadwick said quickly. "She took my car. The highway pass has been closed by the state police since 8 o'clock tonight due to the blizzard," Austin said softly. "No cars have come over the mountain for 3 hours. So how did she drive here, Chadwick?" Chadwick froze. His jaw tightened by a fraction of an inch. Austin turned to the 2 security guards. He did not raise his voice. "Put your weapons away and wait in the truck outside." Now, the guards looked at Austin's face, recognized the look of a man who owned the mountains they were standing on, and backed out of the cabin without a word, closing the door behind them. Chadwick was left standing alone near the doorway. Austin walked to his bed, reached down with gentleness, and helped Sienna sit up. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and handed her a mug of hot coffee from the hearth pot. Sienna took a sip, looked at Austin, and opened the wet leather folder. She laid the original 1898 master deed on the table. Beside it, she laid the forged medical affidavits, the Cayman Islands bank transfers, and the secret sales contract with the Salt Lake mining conglomerate. She looked Austin in the eye and said, "Your nephew sold your water rights to an open-pit mining company. They plan to break ground in 30 days. Everything is in that folder." Austin sat down at his wooden table. He read every single page in silence. The only sound in the log cabin was the wind howling against the timber walls and the crackle of the wood stove. When Austin finished reading the final document, he set the papers down carefully. He did not cry out. He did not slam his fist on the table. He simply turned his head and looked at his nephew. Chadwick's face had gone completely white. The smooth, arrogant corporate operator was gone. In his place was a terrified 31-year-old boy who had just realized that the uncle he tried to ruin was holding the axe. Chadwick swallowed hard. "Uncle Austin, listen to me. It was just a business deal. The land is sitting there doing nothing. We could have been 50 times richer. I did it for the family." Austin looked at him for a long, terrible moment. "My grandfather cleared this dirt with his bare hands," Austin said, his voice measured and quiet. "My father bled on this dirt. I buried your aunt under the cottonwood tree on the South Ridge. You did not do this for the family, Chadwick. You did this because you think paper makes a man. But paper burns. Land stays." Austin stood up. He walked to his landline phone on the wall, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number he knew by heart. He spoke into the receiver. "Sheriff Miller?" This is Austin Vance. I need you and 2 state troopers up at my private cabin right away. I have a grand larceny and federal fraud arrest for you to make." Chadwick tried to run out the front door, but Austin did not even have to catch him. The 2 security guards outside, having heard the conversation through the log walls, blocked the porch steps and held Chadwick until the sheriff arrived 15 minutes later. Chadwick Vance was led out of his uncle's cabin in handcuffs, shivering in his $3,000 suit as the snow fell around him. The following night, the Jackson Hole Grand Lodge was hosting its annual Autumn Heritage Gala. It was a massive, high-society event attended by Denver investors, state politicians, and regional news crews. Chadwick had spent 6 months organizing the gala as the venue where he intended to publicly announce the new commercial development phase of the Vance estate, fully expecting his uncle to be sidelined by the fraudulent power of attorney papers. The room was filled with crystal chandeliers, expensive wine, and men in tuxedos. Even though Chadwick was in a county holding cell, his corporate co-conspirators from the Salt Lake Mining Company were still in attendance, holding copies of the proposed press release and talking quietly about the millions they were about to make off the Vance land. At 8 o'clock, the double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Austin Vance walked into the room. He wore a clean black Western suit, his polished cattleman's boots, and his dark brown hat. Beside him, walking with absolute grace and confidence in a tailored dark blue dress, was Sienna St. James. Her forehead bore a small, neat bandage, but her head was held high, her eyes calm and unshakable. The room went completely silent. Austin walked up to the main stage, stepped up to the microphone, and looked out at the room full of wealthy investors and politicians. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing across the ballroom with complete authority. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My nephew, Chadwick Vance, was scheduled to make an announcement tonight regarding the future of the Vance Ranch. Unfortunately, he could not be here. He is currently being held without bail at the county jail on 6 felony counts of forgery, corporate fraud, and grand theft." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The mining company executives at the front table froze, their faces draining of color. Austin continued. "Some people in this room believed that the Vance Ranch was for sale. They believed that water, honor, and blood could be bought with Cayman Island bank transfers and fake legal papers. So I want to introduce you all to Miss Sienna St. James, senior forensic auditor from Atlanta. She is the woman who walked 3 miles through a blizzard to hand me the truth." The entire room burst into applause. The news cameras pivoted toward the stage, flashes blinking rapidly as reporters recorded the moment. 2 federal marshals, accompanied by the state attorney general's investigators, walked onto the ballroom floor and escorted the mining company executives straight out the side doors in front of every major investor in the West. Chadwick's entire corporate network was dismantled in under 20 minutes. 6 months later, the Vance estate was completely restored. Every forged document was legally erased by the state courts. The water rights were permanently placed into a land trust that could never be sold, mortgaged, or transferred by future generations. Chadwick Vance was convicted on 4 federal felony counts and sentenced to 14 years in a federal penitentiary. He lost his sports car, his Denver high-rise apartment, his trust fund, and his family name. Austin Vance hired Sienna St. James as the chief financial officer and permanent trustee of the Vance Conservation Fund, paying her 3 times what her Atlanta firm had offered her. Sienna relocated her primary office to Jackson Hole, building a life in the West where her brilliance was respected and her integrity was valued above gold. On a warm summer evening, Austin and Sienna sat on the front porch of the private timber cabin, drinking black coffee as the sun sank behind the snow-capped peaks of the Grand Tetons. The 12,000 acres of green pasture stretched out before them, peaceful, whole, and untouched. Austin looked out at the land and said softly, "People who build their lives on lies always forget one basic law of nature. You can fake a signature on a piece of paper, but you cannot fake the dirt." Sienna smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. "The dirt always demands an accounting, Austin." "Yes, it does," Austin said. "And the land always remembers who treated it right." Some people think power is measured in $3,000 suits and offshore bank accounts. But real power is quiet. Real power is knowing who you are, standing on ground your family bled for, and having the patience to let the truth do the work. The people who try to steal your legacy usually do not realize that they are just signing the paperwork for their own downfall. If you stayed until the end, thank you. More stories from Breach and Balance are already on your screen. Click one now. And if you have not subscribed yet, don't miss what's coming next. See you there.